the director of Indiana University's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this opening session of our conference on anti-Semitism in today's America. Round about 1,000 people have registered for the keynote address, and you exist in some 30 different countries. I do feel compelled to say a special word to those of you tuning in from Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. We're all aware of the devastating floods that have hit parts of your country. Our hearts go out to you during a very, very demanding time. And God willing, the recovery will come sooner rather than later. But we recognize this is a very difficult time. Know that we're with you. It's a special privilege to have David Harris as our keynote speaker, and I'll introduce him to you in just a moment. But before then, let me say just a few words about the rationale for our conference. If you hear a note of astonishment in my voice, it stems from the realization that we should even need to take a hard look at anti-Semitism in the United States. Some years ago, I dare say, neither I nor most others would have felt compelled to devote sustained attention to Jew hatred in America. But times have changed, and not for the better. Anti-Semitism, as we all know, dates back over many centuries. It culminated in the most horrific way in the persecution and mass murder of European Jewry during the Nazi era. Primo Levi, the great Italian Jewish writer, himself a survivor of Auschwitz, referred to that catastrophe as the scourge of the 20th century. He also called it the greatest crime in the history of humanity. As Jews count time, that crime happened the day before yesterday. It's been copiously documented by historians and represented countless times in films, literature, museums, and virtually every other medium of culture. So knowledge of the Holocaust is abundantly available. And with that knowledge, it was widely presumed and hoped that the evils unleashed by unrestrained anti-Semitism would be apparent to all. What went wrong? Many of us thought, naively we now realize, that the immense scandal attached to the Nazi genocide of the Jews would prevent public expressions of Jew hatred from once again surfacing in serious and destructive ways. We were simply wrong, for since the turn of the millennium, verbal and physical assaults against Jews and Jewish institutions have proliferated, sometimes lethally so. Knowledge of past Jew hatred, it turns out, while absolutely essential, is not preventative. Anti-Semitism is once again a threatening presence among us and on a global scale. Moreover, as our deliberations will make clear, America is not immune. In the days ahead, we will do our best to address its manifestations, causes, and consequences forthrightly, knowledgeably, and unapologetically. That, together with the task of coming up with practical ways to help restrain a rising anti-Semitism, are the goals we have set ourselves. To get us started, I'm honored to introduce David Harris, our distinguished keynote speaker. For the past 31 years, David has served as head of the American Jewish Committee, the premier global Jewish advocacy organization. He's made it his mission to assist Jews in danger worldwide, support Israel's quest for peace and security, combat anti-Semitism, and defend democratic values against all who oppose it, most especially the radical right and the totalitarian left. No one has done such important work more energetically and more effectively than he. For this reason, Shimon Peres, the late Israeli president, called David Harris the foreign minister of the Jewish people. The honor does him justice, for David has devoted himself tirelessly to getting key people in this country and around the world to support the basic notion that, like everyone else, Jews have the right to live their lives in safety and security and flourish in every way they can, most especially in the post-Holocaust period. It's not easy work, and yet he's done it with dedication, dignity, and a laudable degree of success for over 3 decades now. We are all the better for his efforts. In small ways, I've been honored to join David in some of this work, particularly as it involves opening people's eyes to the nature and threats of contemporary anti-Semitism. Thanks to one of his then colleagues, David Singer, I was invited some years ago to write a series of essays on resurgent anti-Semitism, which the American Jewish Committee published and distributed. One of these pieces, entitled Progressive Jewish Thought and the New Anti-Semitism, was an early attempt to expose aggressive forms of anti-Zionism in the writings of some prominent Jewish thinkers. David wrote the introduction to this piece, and we were both harshly criticized by the New York Times and numerous other places for daring to point to aspects of Jewish progressivism that seemed regressive, especially when such thinking turned against Israel. Looking back, I'm convinced we were ahead of the curve in what we had to say. I'm also convinced we did the right thing in shrugging off the criticism leveled at us and just continued on with our work. In that respect and many others, David has served as a model for me. He will be for you as well, I'm sure, as you listen now to his keynote address, Combating Anti-Semitism at Home and Abroad, a Frontline Perspective. David, how pleased we are to have you join us as our opening speaker.
Alvin, thank you so much for an overly generous introduction, and frankly, an overly humble introduction on your part. It was your idea to write the essay. I had the easier task of writing the introduction. You took the brunt of the criticism, but you were right then, and history has proven just how right you were ever since. So I'd like to thank you in particular and the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism of Indiana University for bringing us all together today. It's a real honor. Of course, I have another sort of mental association with Indiana University, which has nothing to do with the subject matter at hand, but just an infomercial for those of you who have not seen the movie Breaking Away, which has been a favorite of our family since my children were very young. It's another great introduction to Indiana University. I'm not here as a scholar addressing a scholarly conference. I've done my best over many years to study the issues that are at hand. But I want to speak to you, Alvin, as you yourself said a moment ago, as someone who's on the front lines and has to take whatever scholarly and academic research might be available, whether generated by participants in your conference or here at the American Jewish Committee, but apply it in dealing daily with American and world diplomats, elected officials, civil society, other faith, ethnic, and religious groups. And I want to talk a little bit about the experience I've had, particularly, I would say, in the last 21 years, since I would pinpoint the resurgence of modern day anti-Semitism, which brings us all together to the year 2000, in the aftermath of the so-called Second Intifada, and what we saw as a result. So let me first go back in time, Alan, to that period, 2000, 2001, what we saw, what we learned, what lessons we applied, because I think they're still extremely relevant to our conversation today. But before doing so, let me just add one personal word, which was not mentioned in the introduction, but I think is also very relevant for your viewers. And I understand that, as you told me, they're from over 30 countries and number over 1,000 people, which is really quite remarkable. But for those whom I've not had the pleasure of meeting before, I approach this not just as a professional in the field, I approach this very personally. I approach this very personally because the three people in my life closest to me have been the direct targets of real-life anti-Semitism, and they have taught me not just about their own experiences, but about the need for becoming a swivel-headed anti-Semite. And the notion of swivel-headedness is very key to the strategy that AJC has been employing all these years. Let me explain. My late mother, Nellie, was born and raised in the Soviet Union during the period of Stalin. She and her family were among the fortunate to be able to escape at a time when leaving the Soviet Union was becoming next to impossible. They escaped because of the general tyranny and because of the specific targeting of Jews. They landed in France in 1929. By 1940, they were again targeted as Jews after the May invasion of France by Nazi Germany, by its victory and by its then collaboration with the French Vichy government that emerged. So for a second time, my mother as a Jew, and solely as a Jew, became a refugee. So she had fled in her lifetime, first left-wing and then right-wing anti-Semitism. Fortunately, she and her family were able to escape to Spain and then Portugal. And on the eve of Pearl Harbor, miraculously, were among the few to arrive in the United States. My father was born in Budapest, Hungary. He was raised in Berlin and Vienna. In 1938, he was in Vienna when the Anschluss occurred, and subsequently when Kristallnacht occurred. He was able to escape Nazi Germany/Austria, also arrived in France, briefly found refuge. A long story ensued. He was able to come to the United States after the war. But again, central to his journey was the fact that he was a Jew. And my wife, whom I met in 1975 while I was working in Rome, Italy, which was one of the two transit points for Jews able to leave the Soviet Union, the other transit point being Vienna. My wife, Julieta Buchobza, and her family were refugees from Libya. They were among what we today call the forgotten refugees of the Arab-Israeli conflict. They were able to get safe passage from Libya. 3 weeks after pogroms erupted on the streets of Tripoli, their home was targeted. They were threatened with death. They were hidden by one brave local Arab citizen until the Italian government was able to escort them out. To fast forward, there are no Jews left in Libya, none. To the best of my knowledge, there are no traces even of Jewish life which had lasted for more than 2,000 years since the Roman era in Libya. Of course, Libya was one of a number of Arab countries, including Algeria, Sudan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and neighboring countries like Afghanistan, where there are today no Jews left and virtually no trace of Jewish life. So in my own personal experience, simply from the three people closest to me in my life, my mother, my father, and my wife, I learned about what are, for me, the three main sources of anti-Semitism, both then and now: the threat from the far left, the threat from the far right, and the threat from not Muslims, but Islamists in the name of jihadism. So that's by way of sort of my backdrop, and therefore what's framed my view of these issues. In the year 2000, my family and I were living in Geneva, Switzerland. It was the 10th anniversary of my time as CEO of AJC. AJC asked how I wanted to mark my 10th anniversary, I think hoping that I would ask for a fountain pen. Instead, I asked for a year abroad. I took my family to Geneva. I served as the chair of an AJC affiliate at the time, United Nations Watch. I became a visiting faculty member at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies at their campus in Bologna, Italy, where I led 2 graduate seminars. It turned out that that year, Alvin, became among the most formative for me in the battle against anti-Semitism. Until that point, anti-Semitism obviously had never vanished, but it was not the dominant force that it became first in Europe and subsequently in the United States. Let me explain. Living in Geneva at the time, I became witness to several phenomena. Largely, it seemed, prompted by the Second Intifada, which, from my point of view, was a Palestinian attempt to distract from what had become an extraordinarily history-making peace offer by Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, supported by US President Bill Clinton. But rather than engage in that two-state solution on the table, the Palestinians walked away from it. Bill Clinton speaks about it at some length in his autobiography, My Life, and he spells it out so that this doesn't just come from AJC, it comes from the former president of the United States. And we witnessed the Second Intifada. And what we saw sitting in Geneva were several things. One, a largely vicious, and I use the term advisedly, a largely vicious European press. One of my projects during the year abroad was to read as many newspapers in as many languages as I was capable of. It for me was viewed as a fun project. But after the Intifada began, it was a necessary project, but the fun was no more. The media in Spain was particularly vile, I thought. Much of the media in France and Italy, other languages that I could read comfortably, were equally vicious. And the themes were particularly striking. It wasn't just a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians after a failed Israeli attempt to move toward a two-state solution. A lot of demons came out of the closet. For one thing, Nazism. We began a collection at the time of cartoons and headlines and other images used by many in the European media that superimposed Nazi imagery on the Israeli political leadership and on the Israeli defense forces. The notion, if you will, that given power, Jews, you see, were no different than Europeans during the Second World War. Because with that power, Jews were deemed to be the same as the Nazis. And therefore, the well-known Iberian Nobel laureate who accused the West Bank of being the new Auschwitz the references to Gaza as being the new Warsaw Ghetto, Shimon Peres and other Israeli leaders clad in Wehrmacht or SS uniforms. What was going on here? This was way beyond the daily battle between Palestinian protesters and Israeli soldiers seeking to defend the country against the protesters. And from my perspective, this conjured up the notion of the Israeli philosopher, I believe, who some years ago had said, and I really had never quite understood it at the time, that Germany, but in this case, I'll replace it with Europe, will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. That as I came to see this unfold and this kind of this energetic use of Nazi imagery to superimpose on democratic Israel seeking to defend itself after putting a far-reaching two-state deal on the table, including the sharing of Jerusalem, everything that we had been led to believe was being asked for by the Palestinian side. Not only was there a response from the Palestinians, but many in the European media seemed only too happy to jump onto this and to add their own layers of sort of historical narrative on this. After all, in those years, Europe was at the peak of its peaceful project, at the peak of its prosperity. And I can say parenthetically that we and I have long been fans of the European integration project. It's an extraordinarily successful modern day peace project, but there was always that cloud hanging over Europe. And that cloud was how to explain not just the Shoah, but how to explain century upon century upon century of anti-Semitism, racial, religious, social, you name it, but toxic, accompanied by expulsions, ghettos, inquisitions, go down the list until we arrive at the gas chambers and the crematoria of Auschwitz. So here was this kind of this desire in a way to come to terms with the Jews finally and say, you see, the moment you have a gun, you act absolutely no differently than the worst instincts of Europe. So there really is no difference. The difference was only in the distribution of power then, but not now. We also saw the reemergence of the deicide charge, especially because of as some of you will recall, the fact that some Palestinian, the media would call them activists, others would call them terrorists, found refuge in a church and hid in the church. And the Israelis were faced with the dilemma of what to do about that situation. We began to see the images, and again, we have a collection of them, of now the Palestinian child on the cross. The Jews, having killed Jesus 2,000 years ago, were now killing the new Jesus, the Jesus of the Palestinian child. So again, this sometimes dormant, sometimes active, but always present notion of Jews and deicide, Jews and the Nazi era, all coming out. Beyond the media, we saw other things, Alvin. We saw fear on the part of many Jews, especially in France, which became the epicenter of the problem. France, because France was home to the largest Jewish community in Europe, and importantly, because France was home to the largest Muslim community in Europe. And Geneva being close to the French border, we spent a lot of time in France, following the French media, in touch with the French Jewish community, traveling to Paris, including meetings with Jacques Chirac, the president, beginning in 2001 and subsequently. Private meetings, intimate meetings with Jacques Chirac on the part of AJC. And I can tell you, having sat in each of those meetings, that Jacques Chirac was unwilling to acknowledge the fact that Jews were now in fear, that the conflict had been brought to France and Jews were seen as legitimate targets by those who supported the Palestinians in the conflict. And I can still hear Jacques Chirac's words in my ears. Chers amis, vous savez, je connais mon pays mieux de vous. Il n'y a pas d'antisémitisme ici en France. Pas du tout. Dear friends, I know my country better than you. There is no anti-Semitism in this country. Well, Mr. President, we beg to differ, and with respect, there is, and Jews are fearful, and Jews are wondering if the state will remain committed to their safety and security. And this went back and forth, and it went back and forth not just in one meeting, but over a few years. The government early on refused to see the problem. And then I remember a memorable meeting in November of 2001 when I was back in New York with the French foreign minister at the time, Hubert Védrine. It was at the Sofitel here in New York. He brought along his Italian and Spanish counterparts to meet with AJC to discuss these issues. And I remember how he explained the growing problem of the specificity of anti-Semitism, the targeting of Jews in France, with the following words: "It is the regrettable importation of the Arab-Israeli conflict onto French soil." Well, we beg to differ, Mr. Minister. You're giving it legitimacy by even framing it that way. The conflict is between Israelis and Palestinians. To see French Jews as somehow proxies or surrogates, and therefore legitimate targets for the extension of the conflict onto French soil, is not only wrong-headed, but it's a violation of the French commitment to the well-being and protection of all of its citizens, including the Jewish community. But these are the ways in which it was seen. And I'll add just one other dimension from that period. Two of our children were in a Swiss international school, Collège de Léman, just on the outskirts of Geneva. And our children, during their year there, both experienced and witnessed anti-Semitism on the campus, but even worse, and this also gets to the, if you will, the case that I'm building for 2021, the school administration was unwilling, uninterested in dealing with the issues that occurred on the campus and that affected whether my children or whether Israeli students on their campus. They didn't want to get involved. In fact, there was one instance where my youngest son was confronted by an older child who happened to be the son of an Arab ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva. My son was cornered. The older student said to my son, "I hear you're a Jew. I don't like Jews. Tell me you're not a Jew." My son was obviously frightened to death. I can only begin to imagine. But to his credit, he said, "Yes, I am a Jew," and then turned around and ran as fast as he could away from the child. The child chased him. My son saw two faculty or administrators on the campus and breathlessly ran up to them and tried to explain what happened. And when those two adults heard the story, they looked with cold eyes at my son and they said, "This is not the business of the school to deal with." In fact, I subsequently wrote an op-ed in the International New York Times, or as it was then known, the International Herald Tribune, about this. So my point, Alvin, in beginning this conversation is to say that 20 years ago, we already began to see the elements that fueled and fed this demon that we're talking about today, thanks to ISCAR. One, governments that were very, very slow and reluctant to acknowledge the problem, much less respond forcefully. Two, institutions like Collège de Léman, and it was not alone, I assure you, that wanted to avert their eyes, did not want to get involved, did not want to complicate the life of the school, or perhaps even endanger the business model. And three, the media. And at a time when traditional media was still stronger than social media, it's obviously only gotten worse since, that was, in many cases, I can't say in every case, of course, but in many cases, acting irresponsibly and I would argue, at least in some cases, with malice aforethought. And the final thing that I would say about that period, which also helps me understand what's happened since, as I mentioned at the outset, I was leading two graduate seminars at Johns Hopkins at the campus in Bologna, Italy, which was the campus for the School of Advanced International Studies. And in one of the seminars, even before these events really began to unfold, at the beginning of September 2000, I invited the students to spend the year with me trying to develop a business plan for how to grapple with hate. Now, I would have loved to do it about anti-Semitism alone, but the academic circumstances didn't allow, but believe me, the overlap was quite profound. And at the end of the year, the students, to their great credit, had really put together quite an impressive plan. And it had 7 main components. And I think, again, we don't have the time in this opening session, but I hope in the ensuing days, Alvin, and what's to come afterwards, in the work of individual scholars, of organizations like American Jewish Committee, and other interested parties, each of these 7 areas can be further explored for their application today in 2021, whether in the United States or elsewhere. The first, and I say so very consciously, because the students insisted on placing it first, the role of the government or governments in grappling with paroxysm of hate. Let's, for the purposes of this conversation, replace the word hate with anti-Semitism. In the instance of Jacques Chirac, at the beginning of this story, it was a negative role. Subsequently, it became a more positive role, to the point where in the ensuing presidencies of France leading up to President Macron today, I think it's very clear that France has now fully understood the problem, has taken some very significant steps, including the appointment of a, if you will, a commissioner, a coordinator for dealing with anti-Semitism within the country. The president and his predecessors have made some extraordinarily strong statements, equating the future of France with the future of French Jewry and vice versa. So governments can play a constructive role. In fact, my students at Johns Hopkins believe that governments would play the central role, either in creating a framework that said zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, and we will use all the instruments of power available to government, from moral suasion to police, to judiciary, to intelligence, to education, you name it. We will unleash all of them, because we will not accept, under any circumstance, anti-Semitism on our soil. And we see the linkage between anti-Semitism and the future of the country as a whole. Jews are not some separate, discrete entity that we can somehow compartmentalize. So government can play a key role, and the challenge, I believe, for frontline activists is to unleash the power of government constructively in order to pursue all of its possibilities, and not to be slow, not to be hesitant, not to be ambiguous. Obviously, today, if I were asked right now, David, what is it you want governments to do? Well, among other things, what I would want governments to do is to be certain that they have embraced the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism in its entirety, including the 11 spelled out examples, and not just to adopt and embrace it, but to be sure to implement it in its entirety. I would also want to be sure that governments are stating publicly that they will not participate in the 20th anniversary commemoration of what came to be known as the Durban Hate Fest, the UN-sponsored conference in 2001 that was designed to combat racism and racial discrimination, and instead became a modern-day synonym for anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, Holocaust trivialization. And those who were there, including AJC, and I was invited to be an official member of the United States delegation led by Secretary of State Colin Powell, which then withdrew from the conference, can personally attest to what took place. As of today, 9 countries have formally indicated they will not attend, which is welcome news. But there are dozens and dozens of other countries that I would refer to as being in the democratic space who have no business being there. And the question is, will they go because it's politically expedient to go and perhaps politically costly not to go? What will they do? In other words, governments have a daily role and message daily. And the question is, what messages are they messaging? Whether on Durban, whether on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, whether on creating a central address for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism, and in the case of some European countries, adding to that portfolio, promoting and protecting Jewish life. So that's one. The second obvious space that the students at Johns Hopkins explored with me was the home and the family. Here, there's not a lot that I think I need to add because it's self-evident that of all the formative spaces and places for people in our world to get a mindset, a view of the world, a Weltanschauung, a view of their place in the world, a view of their responsibility or lack of responsibility toward others, a view of the world that either says we embrace or we reject people who are unlike us. It begins in the central formative space for that is the family. The third area is religion. And the seminar concluded, perhaps with the obvious conclusion, but nonetheless one that needs to be stated, that religion in itself can be a force for good. Religion in itself can also be a force for evil. The question is, who are the religious leaders? What messages do they choose to express? Where? How? And here, I think that there is at least some encouraging news. As we all know, things are rarely black and white. So we're always looking at sort of competing, if not contradictory trends. But for us, perhaps the single most important breakthrough of the last half century or thereabouts was the 1965 adoption by the Second Vatican Council of what became known as Nostra Aetate, which effectively, after, depending on how you count, let's count from the period of the 4th century, the era of Constantine, for over 1600 years, the Catholic Church had too often been associated with the teaching of deicide, the teaching of contempt, the assignment of the perfidious Jew to roam the earth, the blood libels. This group, I'm sure, knows all of it and more. 1965 began a revolution within the Catholic Church and then between Catholics and Jews, and we are to this day feeling the beneficial effects of that revolution. It was followed at various moments in time by reflections within a number of Protestant denominations, including notably the Lutheran Church. And I would again say that within the last half century or more, there's been a dramatic change in the tone and tenor and texture of Christian-Jewish relations in the United States, in many other parts of the world. That does not mean that the notion that Jews are associated with the deicide charge has completely vanished. As I mentioned earlier, it certainly had not vanished from some in the Spanish media 20 years ago or elsewhere. It does not mean that there are not complications with other parts of the Christian world, but the change has largely been for the better. And AJC was a key Jewish player in that process in the 20th century. In the 21st century, we at AJC have determined that for us, the single most important interfaith challenge, and it deals directly with the notion of anti-Semitism, is the Muslim-Jewish frontier. Now, unlike the Catholic Church, the Muslim church, the Muslim world, I should say, like the Jewish world, is a largely flattened or horizontal world. It's not a pyramidal world in which, if you can get the College of Cardinals together and with the support of the Pope, adopt, in this case, Nostra Aetate, then in a matter of time, the distribution network of the Catholic Church will convey that message to every parish priest, every parish church across the world, and it will be pursued. In the Muslim world, it's more complicated, as it is in the Jewish world. We felt we had a couple of breakthroughs recently, and they need to be pursued more vigorously, and obviously not just by AJC. One was in January of 2020, where together with the Secretary of the Muslim World League, arguably the most prominent Sunni Muslim organization in the world, an individual who was appointed by the King of Saudi Arabia, the custodian of the two holy mosques, we traveled together to Auschwitz and Birkenau. He in turn invited 62 Muslim leaders from around the world to join his entourage. We traveled together. It was a remarkable experience. And the world media covered it. And we felt a major step had been taken in breaking down some of the barriers between Muslims and Jews. We've also developed a Muslim Jewish Advisory Council across the United States, both national and with regional affiliates. We've also developed a series of films in Arabic language, short videos, explaining the Jews, who we are, commonalities between Judaism and Islam, the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, the Jewish experience in Arab majority, Muslim majority countries. We have had over 90 million views of these first 5 videos. So we are trying to make substantial inroads. The fourth area is in the sphere of education. And here, Alvin, there's a lot to discuss, and certainly the students had a lot in mind when they put this, but let me just mention one or two elements of it for now. One is in the realm of Holocaust education. Whenever you speak to anyone, scholar or practitioner, dealing with anti-Semitism, you're likely to hear that the single most important response mechanism is education. Well, who could argue with that? The problem is not in the word. The problem is in deconstructing the word and understanding exactly what it means. So take, for example, Holocaust education in the year 2021. Holocaust education today is quite different than Holocaust education 25 years ago. And 25 years from now, I submit Holocaust education will be even more different than it is today. Why? Well, the first and most obvious reason is because today there are fewer and fewer survivors, eyewitnesses, liberators of the camps than there were 25 years ago. And I suspect 25 years from now, there may be none left, or certainly none left who are able to go to schools in person and tell their stories. So we're going to be left with the second generation, people like myself, if that, or the third generation, my children. We're going to be left with museums, monuments, memorials, video archives, books, you name it. But at such a distance that the question becomes, how relevant will this be for students? How credible will this be for students? Let me ask a more provocative question, which we already have seen, particularly in countries like France, as countries evolve demographically. How much are students going to be willing to accept this information and accept it as part of their own national history? As Germany in particular, which I believe has largely and very laudably dealt with its own wartime history since, Germany has always said that we do not believe in collective guilt. Why should we? And they shouldn't, not 3-4 generations later. But they do believe in collective responsibility, which leads or has led Angela Merkel, for example, to put the relationship with Israel on the level of what the Germans call Staatsräson, which means a pillar of their national foreign and security policy. Is that something that the changing demography of European countries like France and Germany will accept? Well, in the case of France, we know that it's going to be very, very difficult. In fact, there's been at least one book written that I know of in French, the English translation of which is The Lost Territories of the Republic, which discusses how teachers are often unable to teach the national curriculum related to the Holocaust because their students are rejecting the very notion. They're pushing back. There was no Holocaust. You want to know what a Holocaust is? Study of the Nakba that affected the Palestinians in 1947, 1948. The Holocaust was a fiction created by the Jews to justify the illegal establishment of the state of Israel. Now, even the best intentioned teachers in those environments may not have the tools for how to grapple with that situation. And as we have heard, some teachers are actually quite ideologically sympathetic to the students, making it even harder. So education, absolutely. But how do you teach education when the eyewitnesses are no longer there, when the history now seems closer to the Crimean War than to the present, and when some students are actively pushing back and challenging the very narratives that are being introduced? So that's one challenge. And the second challenge, which I think many of us are seeing all too frequently, first in universities, now in some high schools, is creating an atmosphere which, whether as a result of critical race theory, intersectionality, go down the list, is creating unsafe spaces for pro-Israel students, for Jewish students who actively identify as Jewish students and see Israel as an important part of their identity. And the challenge clearly for those high schools and universities is to ensure not that their teachers teach a pro-Israel curriculum. I don't believe that that ought to be the goal of a good education. On the other hand, I also believe that these should not become venues for the propagation of ideologies held by the teachers or the teaching assistants or whoever may be in charge of the class. And we have seen, and this is not the time to rehearse it, how some universities have responded very clearly, forcefully and decisively in defending the pro-Israel students and their space, the Jewish students and their space where they have been challenged or violated or bullied or intimidated. And we have seen other schools and universities where administrators have waffled. And when they waffle, it's like the political leaders I discussed earlier. When they waffle, they send a mixed message to the campus at a time when we believe there is no space for a mixed message. Things are way too combustible. The fifth area is the media. Now, 20 years ago, 21 years ago, most of the focus was on traditional media. And we studied the Spanish media, the cartoons, the headlines, the photographs, the placement of articles that I and others came across. But 20 years later, obviously the main subject matter has shifted from traditional media to social media. And this would be a subject all unto itself. But I can tell you, having met with pretty much every interior minister in Europe, and many on this call know that interior ministries in Europe are not the same as the Interior Department in the United States. In Europe, it's not about national parks, for example. It's about internal security. And they have told us repeatedly that if there was one thing they could do to help them address the subject of anti-Semitism, it would be to engage with Silicon Valley, with the big tech companies, with the major social media platforms on questions not just of First Amendment rights, but on corporate social responsibility. Where do First Amendment rights end and corporate social responsibility begin? A huge topic of conversation, but absolutely necessary, because anyone studying anti-Semitism today has to come right back to the power of social media as the, if you will, the Cape Canaveral, the Cape Kennedy, the launching pad, the distribution network to billions upon billions of people, many of whom younger people without the intellectual or other filters to be able to understand what it is they're reading. Number 6, in the student group study was civil society. How does civil society respond to manifestations of anti-Semitism? Energetically, indifferently, apathetically. And here, they chose to point out two things in particular. One positive example, and many cited Denmark, 1943, the Nazi plan to arrest and deport the Jews, and a spontaneous response on the part of many in Danish society who saw the Jews not as the other, but as their neighbors, to help round them up constructively, safely, and take them by boat to neutral Sweden, where they lived safely to the end of the war. The other example that was cited was Billings, Montana, in the 1990s, where, as some of you may know, a big rock was thrown into the window of a Jewish home that was displaying a Hanukkah menorah in the window. It happened to be a child's bedroom, and only by luck the child was not struck by the rock, which could have killed the child. And within days, led by civil society, led by the newspaper editor in Billings and the police chief in Billings, the paper issued a full-page paper cut menorah and invited people to tear out the menorah and to place it in their windows, suggesting that all of them, for this purpose, were Jews, isolating the anti-Semite or the anti-Semites who had thrown the rock into this Jewish home. And it worked. So how civil society responds becomes critically important as a positive factor, and obviously conversely, if it chooses not to respond or only responds selectively, and I'll set myself up for what will be the second and final point, Alvin. If they respond selectively, meaning when it comes from the far right, from neo-Nazis, they respond. When it comes from other sources, they don't show up. That too becomes a critical factor of civil society. And the seventh and final piece of the story is the justice system, the police, the courts, the prosecutors. How do they deal with serious acts of anti-Semitism? Do they even recognize it, with or without the IRA working definition? Do they view it as a hate crime? Are there special penalties for hate crimes? Are those penalties being sought and invoked? Big questions. And again, Alvin, we could talk about this at length, illustrating where it has happened, illustrating where it has not happened. I'll just give you one glaring illustration where it has not happened, one of a number. Wuppertal, Germany, a few years ago, 3 Palestinians attacked the synagogue in Wuppertal, Germany. They firebombed the synagogue. They were arrested. Ultimately, they were released. They were released because the court ruled that they were angry about Israeli actions in the Middle East, that they had no other venue in their area of Germany to express their anger. The synagogue, therefore, became a legitimate surrogate for Israel. They firebombed the synagogue, and there was a story. Not the only such example, but one of several. So, bottom line, if we want to address contemporary anti-Semitism and not just discuss it, not just describe it, but react to it, respond to it, we have to ask and we have to insist on the roles of government, on the roles of family, on the role of faith leaders, on the role of our schools and educators, beginning in elementary, going straight through university, on the role of media, and particularly social media, on the role of civil society, and on the role of our police, our prosecutors, and our justice system. And my final point. Most of us did not foresee how this cancer would travel as swiftly and as threateningly as it did from Europe to the United States. All I want to say is we brought with us to our analysis of the emerging threat in the United States the swivel-headedness that I referred to early on, Alvin. The notion that anti-Semitism comes from multiple sources, And if one is serious about combating anti-Semitism, one cannot play cheap partisan politics or seek to instrumentalize anti-Semitism for one's favorite sort of view of the world. So we AJC insisted on that swivel-headedness. Unfortunately, too many others did not, including some in the Jewish world. Alvin, recall the reaction to your own piece written for AJC and the responses both from inside and outside the Jewish world. One illustration. Early on in the Trump administration, there were a series of threats, dozens of threats that were received by JCCs and other Jewish organizations in the United States. The immediate assumption was made that this had to do with Trump's arrival in the White House. He must have unleashed something. And so many acted on that assumption. They didn't wait. Lo and behold, remember who the perpetrator turned out to be? A young Jew, 16, 17 years old, whose family had moved to Israel. He was operating from the basement of his family's home, and he was sending out these threats. But then we began to have a kind of reinforced narrative of the Trump era. Charlottesville, the president's very regrettable response early on to Charlottesville. True, absolutely true. I'm not here to defend this or any president. Followed by Pittsburgh, followed by Poway. And then what followed Poway? It was Jersey City and the murder of 2 Jews in Jersey City. There was a congresswoman, a kind of noisy congresswoman from Detroit, Michigan, who upon hearing about Jersey City tweeted, "White supremacy kills." Her notion being, well, this was Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Poway, let's add Jersey City to the story. The problem was that Jersey City did not fit her narrative. The perpetrators, at least those identified by the police, were 2 African Americans who claimed to be affiliated with Black Hebrews who insisted that they were the authentic, legitimate Jews. Well, that congresswoman then deleted her tweet and strikingly lost all interest in who the perpetrators were, because she was in the business of instrumentalizing or politicizing the fight against anti-Semitism. There can be no place for that. For anyone who's serious, at least in our estimation, about fighting anti-Semitism in the 21st century, whether in the United States, in Europe, or elsewhere, there's no room for partisan politics. We have to be honest brokers. We have to call them out as we see them. When there's a Republican member of Congress who sits today on the floor of the House of Representatives who believes in QAnon conspiratorial theories linking Jews with space lasers, we have to call out that individual and call on her party to distance themselves as much as they can from that individual, period, full stop, no other explanations needed. And similarly, when the Democratic Party today has at least one member who has expressed more than once clear, unambiguous anti-Semitic statements, the Democratic Party has the exact same obligation, and rather than point fingers at the other party, should be examining itself. And here, I have to say, until now, the party has failed. It's failed because when some members of the party wanted to name this congresswoman from Minnesota by name in a resolution on the floor of the House, in the end, the negotiation over that legislation went on for so long that it ultimately produced a sanitized, anodyne resolution condemning every ism and phobia under the sun. Anti-Semitism was completely lost in the mix, so much so that the member of Congress who had been the original target voted for the resolution. So if we're honest, we've got to focus on the fact that there are problems on the far right, the identitarian right, the ethno-nationalist right, the neo-Nazi right, and we've got to focus on the fact that there are problems on the far left, the identitarian left, the Israel-obsessed left, the privilege-obsessed left, and yes, we have to remember that there are also not peaceful Muslims by any stretch, but the same kind of jihadists who embrace Hamas and Hezbollah and other genocidal groups who are here in the United States, who showed their faces in May on the streets of New York and Los Angeles and elsewhere, who threatened and intimidated Jews as Jews, Jews as kippah wearers, Jews as kosher diners. We've got to be honest about all this. And again, we have to demand of our officials, not that they hide, not that they're missing in action, not that they equivocate, not that they issue press releases at 3 o'clock in the morning when they hope no one is watching to condemn these events. They have to come out squarely and forcefully. If we're going to deal with anti-Semitism in today's world, the theme has to be, where's the outrage? And the answer has to be zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, just as we would expect zero tolerance for any form of racism or hatred in the United States.
David, we applaud you. And I know I speak for everyone listening to you in saying as much. From your personal recount of family history, plus your year in Europe to today, you've given us a wake-up call. And gosh, do we all need it. We will certainly make sure that your message is widely circulated, widely spread, and not just listened to, but acted upon. As we both know, we are less than 24 hours after the end of Tisha B'Av. We commemorated a catastrophe in Jewish history. As you talked about your family background, another catastrophe in Jewish history. Dayenu, we've had enough catastrophes, and we don't want another one. And both as scholars and as activists, we simply must take everything that you put before us to heart, think about it hard, probe into what's behind it, and then come up with ways to effectively contend with it. And you've given us a roadmap to do that. So I can't thank you enough. It's wonderful, as always, to see you. You and I have worked together in the past. I look forward to more in the future. And God bless you as you go on your way. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to introduce now Günther Yekeli and Melissa Deckard. This conference couldn't be put together without the help of these colleagues. They've been wonderful, and we've worked very closely and productively together. Günther, I know you have a word you would like to address to our listeners. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, David Harris, for this great talk. I think we couldn't have wished for a better keynote speaker for a scholarly conference on anti-Semitism in today's America. You made it clear that what the global context is, how important it is, and I think David Harris gave us a clear task. Studying anti-Semitism seriously comes with a commitment to do everything to combat it and to produce rigorous research that hopefully helps to combat it. We'll now convene for 6 days with a group of scholars to discuss these issues intensely. And today is the first day. And all the participant scholars, they will connect in a few minutes. If you're among them, please click on the link that Missy Deckard sent you last night after logging out from this webinar. David Harris, thank you again for inspiring us and this very passionate talk. Very much hope to see you soon again at Indiana University. Please know that you have many friends here. That is, I think, all we can do for now for this webinar. And we will log out. And for those scholars who are ready to debate with us for 6 days, we'll see you shortly in a couple of minutes.